I have presided over murder trials, corruption scandals, and cases so violent they left entire families shattered. But nothing prepared me for the morning. Emily Carter walked into my courtroom holding the hand of a little girl who refused to look at her own father. Even now, years later, I can still remember the silence that swallowed that courtroom, the second I noticed the child trembling beside the witness stand. In my 23 years on the bench, I learned to recognize fear almost instantly. Real fear has a pattern to it. It hides in the eyes, in the shoulders, in the way a person breathes when they think nobody is watching. And that little girl, she looked terrified long before a single word of testimony had been given. At first glance, the case appeared ordinary. A custody dispute, another bitter divorce, another wealthy couple destroying each other while attorneys charged thousands of dollars an hour to turn private pain into public warfare. I thought it would be resolved within 2 days. I was wrong. The moment Daniel Carter entered the courtroom, I noticed something that disturbed me deeply. He smiled too much. Now, you may think that sounds insignificant, but years in court teach you how dangerous certain smiles can be. Innocent people entering family court usually appear nervous, exhausted, emotional. Daniel Carter looked calm, almost entertained. Expensive charcoal suit, perfect posture, confident stride. He shook hands with his attorney like a businessman arriving for a meeting he already expected to win. But it wasn't his confidence that unsettled me. It was the way his daughter reacted when he got close. She immediately tightened her grip around her mother's hand and lowered her eyes to the floor. That was the first moment my instincts started warning me that something inside this case was terribly wrong. Emily Carter sat quietly at the plaintiff's table, her face pale from weeks of stress. I could see exhaustion in her expression before proceedings even began. She looked like someone who hadn't slept properly in months. Yet Daniel looked untouched by the divorce, controlled, composed, almost rehearsed. Believe me, men like that rarely walk into court unprepared. As the attorneys introduced themselves, I studied the jury candidates waiting quietly in the gallery. Some looked bored, others sympathetic. None of them knew that before this trial ended, several people inside that room would leave in tears. The opening statements began routinely enough. Emily's attorney claimed Daniel was emotionally manipulative, psychologically abusive, and unfit to maintain primary custody of 8-year-old Sophie Carter. Daniel's attorney immediately dismissed the accusations as an emotionally unstable woman attempting to weaponize the child during divorce proceedings. I had heard those exact words hundreds of times before. Family court is full of accusations poisoned by anger. But then something happened that changed the atmosphere instantly. Sophie accidentally looked toward her father for less than 2 seconds, and Daniel smiled at her. It wasn't a loving smile. It wasn't comforting. It was controlled, sharp. A silent warning disguised as affection. And the little girl immediately froze. Even the courtroom clerk noticed it. I saw her glance up from her paperwork with concern before quickly looking away. That moment stayed with me. Because fear inside children is rarely random. Children know when adults are dangerous long before the legal system catches up. Emily's attorney called the first witness, Dr. Rebecca Hayes, a child psychologist who had evaluated Sophie over multiple sessions. The courtroom grew quieter as she explained Sophie's severe anxiety symptoms, night terrors, panic attacks, emotional withdrawal, fear of being alone with her father. Daniel remained expressionless the entire time. Not once did he react emotionally to hearing his own daughter described as psychologically distressed. That alone bothered me more than I can explain. Most parents accused falsely in custody court react with anger, confusion, desperation. Daniel simply observed, calmly, like a man waiting for an inevitable conclusion. Then Dr. Hayes said something I will never forget. She looked directly toward the jury and quietly stated, "Children usually reveal trauma indirectly before they ever verbalize it directly." The entire courtroom became still. Even Daniel shifted slightly for the first time. I leaned forward in my chair because suddenly I realized this case might not be about custody at all. Emily began crying silently beside her attorney while Dr. Hayes described Sophie drawing disturbing images during therapy sessions. Dark rooms, locked doors, a man without eyes standing over a child's bed. Daniel's lawyer objected immediately, arguing speculation and emotional manipulation. I allowed partial testimony but instructed the jury carefully. Still, I could feel tension spreading through the courtroom like smoke. And then came the moment that changed everything for me personally. Sophie was asked whether she wanted to speak privately with the court counselor before testimony scheduling. The The little girl nodded slowly. But before leaving the courtroom, she suddenly stopped beside my bench. She looked up at me with terrified eyes I still remember clearly to this day. And in the quietest voice imaginable, she whispered something that made my blood run cold. She said, "If I tell the truth," he said, "Mommy disappears forever." And then she walked away. The courtroom never heard her words except me. But from that moment forward, I knew this case was hiding something far darker than divorce, something calculated, something terrifying. And as I watched Daniel Carter sitting motionless at the defense table with that same unreadable smile on his face, I realized I was no longer looking at an ordinary father fighting for custody. I was looking at a man who had mastered the art of appearing harmless. But believe me, the most dangerous people I ever encountered in court were never the loudest ones. They were the calm ones, the ones who smiled while everyone else panicked. And I had the terrible feeling that Daniel Carter was about to reveal exactly who he truly was. The moment Sophie left the courtroom with the counselor, I felt an uneasiness I could not ignore. Judges are trained to separate emotion from evidence. We are taught to remain neutral no matter how disturbing a case becomes. But there are rare moments when instinct quietly whispers that danger is sitting directly in front of you, wearing an expensive suit and a polite smile. Daniel Carter triggered that instinct in me almost immediately. I remember watching him lean back in his chair while his attorney continued arguing procedural motions as if nothing unusual had happened. Not once did he ask about his daughter. Not once did he look concerned about the fear she was clearly displaying. Instead, he calmly organized papers on the table with the precision of a man who needed control over every tiny detail around him. And people like that, they often become dangerous when control begins slipping away. During a short recess, I remained alone in chambers reviewing preliminary psychological reports connected to Sophie's therapy evaluations. The deeper I read, the more unsettled I became. The child had repeatedly demonstrated signs of coercive fear behavior. Now, most people watching courtroom documentaries online misunderstand what that means. Fear is not always bruises or screaming. Sometimes fear looks like silence. Sometimes fear looks like obedience. Dr. Rebecca Hayes had documented that Sophie constantly monitored adult reactions before speaking, almost as if she had been trained to avoid saying the wrong thing. That is not normal behavior for an 8-year-old child. One note in particular caught my attention. Sophie reportedly asked her therapist whether judges can stop fathers from finding people. I read that sentence 3 separate times because something about it disturbed me deeply. Children do not invent fears like that randomly. Somebody places those fears inside them. And suddenly, I found myself thinking back to the exact way Daniel smiled when Sophie avoided eye contact with him earlier that morning. It was not affection, it was satisfaction. When court resumed, the atmosphere inside the room had changed completely. Even the jury pool seemed more alert now. People sensed tension building beneath the surface of the custody dispute. Emily looked emotionally exhausted, clutching tissues in trembling hands while her attorney prepared the next witness. Daniel, meanwhile, remained unnervingly composed. He crossed one leg over the other and occasionally whispered calmly to his lawyer, as though he were discussing stock market numbers instead of his daughter's psychological trauma. Then the prosecution introduced financial records that shifted the case in an unexpected direction. Emily's attorney revealed that Daniel had secretly transferred nearly $2 million into offshore accounts only weeks before filing for divorce. The courtroom immediately stirred with whispers. Daniel's attorney objected aggressively, claiming financial activity was irrelevant to custody. But I allowed limited discussion because hidden assets during divorce proceedings can indicate preparation for disappearance, manipulation, or coercion. And believe me, I had seen wealthy defendants attempt terrifying things to maintain control over their families. Daniel finally reacted emotionally for the first time that day. Barely. A tightening of the jaw, a colder stare toward Emily. Tiny details most people would never notice. But after decades on the bench, I learned that dangerous personalities reveal themselves through the smallest cracks in composure. Emily then testified about the final months of their marriage. Her voice shook constantly, but what struck me most was how carefully she chose her words. Victims living under long-term psychological control often speak cautiously because fear conditions them to expect punishment even after escape. She described Daniel monitoring her phone calls, isolating her socially, controlling finances, and repeatedly threatening that she would lose everything if she ever tried taking Sophie away from him. Daniel showed absolutely no reaction during her testimony except occasional blinking. That alone made several jurors visibly uncomfortable. One older woman in the jury section kept staring at him with growing concern. People naturally expect emotional denial from falsely accused spouses. Daniel displayed none. And then Emily revealed something that caused complete silence inside the courtroom. 3 months earlier, she claimed Sophie woke up screaming in the middle of the night after overhearing Daniel talking on the phone. According to Emily, Sophie later whispered that, "Daddy says people disappear when they become problems." The words hung over the courtroom like smoke. Daniel's attorney immediately objected again, calling the testimony speculative and inflammatory. But what happened next changed the entire direction of the trial, because instead of becoming angry, Daniel smiled. Calmly, slowly, right there in front of the jury. I will never forget that moment for the rest of my life. It wasn't the smile of an innocent man falsely accused. It was the smile of someone enjoying the fear spreading through the room. And suddenly, even I struggled to maintain composure. The jury noticed it too. I saw two jurors exchange deeply uneasy glances, while Daniel continued sitting there like a man watching a performance he had already seen before. Courtroom energy matters more than people realize. Human beings instinctively sense danger before logic fully explains it. That courtroom had started feeling unsafe. The next witness was a private security consultant hired during the divorce proceedings after Emily reported suspicious incidents near her home. At first, I assumed this would be minor testimony. I was wrong. The consultant described multiple occasions where unidentified vehicles followed Emily after custody exchanges. Security footage showed unknown men parked near her residence late at night. Emily's attorney then displayed photographs on the courtroom monitors. Grainy surveillance images, black SUVs, a man standing outside her neighborhood for nearly 2 hours. The gallery became completely silent. Daniel finally leaned forward slightly for the first time all afternoon. But what disturbed me most was not the surveillance itself. It was Sophie's reaction when the images appeared on the screen. She immediately buried her face into her mother's shoulder and started shaking uncontrollably. Children do not fake terror like that. Not convincingly, not repeatedly. And at that exact moment, a horrifying thought entered my mind. What if this little girl wasn't afraid of losing her father? What if she was afraid of what her father was capable of doing? As proceedings continued, I began noticing something even more alarming. Daniel never once looked toward Sophie with warmth or concern. He watched her the same way a strategist studies a problem, calculating, observing, measuring reactions. That is when my instincts became certainty. This case was no longer simply about custody. Something much darker existed beneath the surface. And deep down, I think Daniel knew I was beginning to see it. Then, just before adjournment, Daniel requested permission to address the court personally. His attorney appeared surprised by the request, which immediately caught my attention. I granted limited permission. Daniel stood slowly, buttoned his jacket, and looked directly toward me with terrifying calmness. The entire courtroom went silent. And then he said something that made the atmosphere inside that room instantly turn cold. He said, "Your Honor, sometimes children become confused when one parent teaches them to fear the other. But eventually, truth always comes out." The way he said the word truth disturbed me deeply, because it didn't sound like reassurance. It sounded like a threat. And when he slowly turned his eyes toward Emily after speaking, I saw genuine fear appear on her face for the first time that entire day. Not anxiety, not stress, real fear. The kind that comes from knowing someone far too well. That night, long after court ended, I sat alone inside chambers, replaying every second of the trial in my mind. I could not shake the feeling that we were missing something enormous, something hidden carefully beneath years of manipulation and control. And I had no idea that within the next 24 hours, a single piece of evidence would push this case into territory so shocking that even veteran court officers would struggle to believe it. I barely slept that night. In over 2 decades on the bench, I learned something most people never understand about courtroom trials. The truth almost never explodes into the room all at once. It leaks out slowly, quietly, through inconsistencies, through body language, through fear people try desperately to hide. And the deeper this custody case went, the more convinced I became that Daniel Carter was hiding something far worse than emotional manipulation. By the following morning, the courthouse atmosphere had changed completely. Court officers who normally joked near the security entrance were unusually quiet. Word about the strange testimony from the previous day had already spread through the building. Even experienced legal staff sensed tension surrounding the case. When I entered the courtroom, I immediately noticed Emily sitting alone at the plaintiff's table, nervously scanning the room. Sophie was absent that morning after the court counselor recommended she remain outside proceedings temporarily due to emotional distress. But Daniel arrived precisely on time, looking more composed than ever. Dark navy suit, silver tie, calm expression. If someone walked into that courtroom without context, they would have mistaken him for a successful politician or corporate executive instead of a father accused of psychologically terrorizing his own child. And honestly, that was exactly what frightened me most about him. Dangerous people often hide behind professionalism because society trusts appearances too easily. The morning session began with testimony from Daniel's former business associate, Michael Reeves. At first glance, Reeves appeared terrified just being inside the courtroom. He avoided eye contact repeatedly and kept rubbing his hands together while answering basic procedural questions. I have seen witnesses frightened before, but this was different. He looked like a man afraid of consequences beyond the courtroom itself. Emily's attorney questioned him regarding Daniel's offshore financial transfers and private security arrangements. Reeves initially answered cautiously, choosing every word carefully. Then the prosecutor asked whether Daniel had ever discussed contingency plans related to the divorce. The entire courtroom became silent. Reeves hesitated for nearly 10 seconds before speaking. Daniel believed losing control of his family would destroy his reputation, he finally said quietly. I watched Daniel closely during that testimony. Still calm, still emotionless, but his eyes changed slightly, colder, sharper, like a man silently warning someone to stop talking. Reeves then revealed that Daniel had become increasingly paranoid during the months leading up to the divorce. According to him, Daniel frequently hired investigators to monitor Emily's movements and obsessively discussed betrayal, humiliation, and public image. But then came the moment that truly shook the courtroom. Reeves admitted Daniel once asked him whether it was possible to make someone disappear legally. Even the court reporter stopped typing for half a second. The gallery erupted into whispers before I immediately restored order. Daniel's attorney objected aggressively, arguing speculation and character assassination. But the damage had already been done, because every single person in that courtroom suddenly realized the same horrifying possibility at once. Emily's fear might have been completely justified. Daniel finally reacted visibly. He turned slowly toward Reeves with a stare so cold that even I felt unsettled watching it. And Reeves immediately lowered his eyes like a man regretting everything he had just said. Believe me, intimidation inside courtrooms rarely requires words. Some people know exactly how to weaponize silence. During cross-examination, Daniel's attorney attempted to portray Reeves as a disgruntled ex-employee motivated by revenge. But something felt wrong about the defense strategy. Daniel barely communicated with his attorney anymore. Instead, he spent most of the testimony quietly observing the jury, studying them, measuring reactions. I had seen defendants manipulate courtrooms before, but Daniel operated differently. He behaved like someone constantly calculating psychological pressure points inside the room. And then something happened that changed the case forever. Halfway through the afternoon session, a court officer approached my bench holding an evidence envelope delivered anonymously that morning. There was no return address, no identifying information, only the case number written across the front. Normally, anonymous evidence submissions are handled carefully through procedure review before presentation. But the officer informed me the package contained material directly related to child safety concerns. I authorized preliminary examination in chambers during recess. The moment I opened the envelope, my stomach tightened. Inside was a flash drive and several printed photographs. At first, the images appeared ordinary. Daniel entering office buildings, parking garages, restaurants. But then I noticed timestamps, late-night hours, repeated locations, different dates. The same unidentified black SUV from Emily's surveillance evidence appeared in nearly every photograph. Whoever sent the package had been tracking Daniel for weeks. Then I opened the digital files on the courthouse laptop. What I saw next is something I will never forget for the rest of my career. The screen displayed hidden camera footage recorded inside what appeared to be a private storage warehouse. The video quality was grainy, but Daniel was clearly visible speaking to two unidentified men near stacks of equipment crates. Audio was distorted initially, then suddenly one sentence became painfully clear. Daniel said, "I don't care what it costs. Once custody is finalized, she becomes irrelevant." I felt genuine chills run through me hearing those words. Judges are trained not to jump to conclusions, but context matters, timing matters, threat patterns matter. And after everything already presented in court, that statement sounded horrifying. I immediately ordered the footage authenticated and temporarily sealed pending evidentiary review. But the existence of that recording changed my understanding of the entire case. This was no longer just psychological intimidation. This looked organized, planned, deliberate. When proceedings resumed, I noticed Daniel studying me carefully the moment I returned to the bench, almost as if he sensed something had changed. Experienced manipulators are highly sensitive to shifts in authority behavior. And suddenly, for the first time since trial began, Daniel no longer looked completely comfortable. Emily's attorney then introduced phone records showing repeated contact between Daniel and several private security contractors during suspicious incidents near Emily's residence. The jury looked increasingly disturbed as timelines connected together piece by piece, but the emotional breaking point came unexpectedly. Near the end of the session, Sophie entered the courtroom briefly with the child counselor after requesting permission to speak privately with her mother. As Daniel turned toward her, the little girl froze completely in the aisle. Then she started crying uncontrollably, not loudly, not dramatically, quiet panic, the kind children display when they feel trapped near someone they fear deeply. Emily rushed to comfort her while the courtroom sat in stunned silence. And then Sophie suddenly screamed words that nobody inside that room was prepared to hear. He said, "Bad things happen if people talk." Even now, I can still hear the terror in that child's voice. The entire courtroom erupted instantly. Jurors looked horrified. Spectators gasped. Daniel's attorney immediately demanded the statement be stricken from record, while court officers moved quickly to restore order. But Daniel himself never reacted emotionally, not once. He simply stared at Sophie with the same cold, expressionless face that had haunted me since day one. And at that moment, I realized something terrifying. Innocent men usually panic when children accuse them publicly. Daniel looked annoyed, like someone losing patience with a problem becoming difficult to control. As court adjourned for the evening, I ordered additional protective review measures regarding Sophie's welfare pending further investigation. Daniel stood silently beside his attorney gathering documents while spectators whispered nervously throughout the gallery. But just before leaving the courtroom, he looked directly toward me and smiled again. That same controlled smile. And for the first time in many years, I felt something I rarely experience inside court. I felt personally uneasy, because deep down, I knew this case was approaching something explosive, something hidden beneath years of manipulation and fear. And I had no idea that by the next morning, the prosecution would uncover evidence so disturbing that even seasoned investigators would struggle to explain how Emily and Sophie survived as long as they did. The following morning, I arrived at the courthouse earlier than usual. Something about the Carter case had begun affecting me personally, and I did not like admitting that to myself. Judges survive emotionally by maintaining distance. The moment a case enters your thoughts outside the courtroom, it becomes dangerous. But this one already had. I kept replaying Sophie's terrified voice in my mind. He said, "Bad things happen if people talk." Children can misunderstand many things, but genuine fear is rarely one of them. And after reviewing the anonymous warehouse footage the previous night, I knew we were no longer dealing with ordinary custody litigation. We were circling something far darker. When I entered chambers, 2 investigators from Child Protective Services were already waiting alongside courthouse security officials. That alone told me the situation had escalated significantly overnight. One investigator placed a thick folder on my desk and quietly informed me that emergency background reviews into Daniel Carter had uncovered disturbing inconsistencies. Former employees had refused interviews. Several business associates abruptly stopped cooperating after initially agreeing to provide statements. One investigator described the pattern as organized intimidation behavior. Believe me, those are words judges never want to hear attached to an active custody case involving a child. But the most disturbing discovery involved a woman named Natalie Pierce. According to records, she briefly dated Daniel nearly 9 years earlier before disappearing suddenly from her workplace and social circles. At first, the connection appeared unrelated, but then investigators discovered something chilling. Natalie filed a police complaint against Daniel only 3 weeks before vanishing. The complaint described controlling behavior, threats, and fear for her personal safety. The case was never pursued due to lack of evidence after she disappeared. My stomach tightened reading those reports. Patterns matter in court. And suddenly Daniel Carter no longer looked like a manipulative husband going through divorce. He looked like a man with a history nobody had fully uncovered yet. Court began under unusually heavy security that morning. Additional officers stood near exits while reporters gathered outside the courthouse after rumors from previous testimony leaked publicly. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere felt electric, tense, expectant. Emily looked exhausted beyond words, but for the first time since proceedings began, I also noticed something else in her expression. Hope, like she sensed Daniel's carefully constructed image was finally beginning to crack. Daniel himself appeared different too, still controlled, but less relaxed than before. Tiny details revealed it: a clenched jaw, faster blinking, fingers tapping once against the defense table before stopping immediately when he noticed me watching. Manipulators often unravel slowly when they realize they are losing control of the narrative. The prosecution opened the session by requesting permission to introduce newly authenticated audio evidence connected to the warehouse footage. Daniel's attorney objected immediately, demanding delay for procedural review. But after legal arguments, I permitted limited presentation pending full admissibility evaluation. The courtroom became completely silent as the enhanced recording played through courtroom speakers. At first, only static and muffled voices filled the room. Then Daniel's voice emerged clearly enough for everyone to hear, calm, controlled, emotionless. "She thinks the court can protect her," he said. "Once this is over, none of it matters anymore." A wave of whispers spread instantly across the gallery. Emily lowered her head and began crying silently while Sophie's counselor quickly escorted the child outside before further exposure to testimony. Daniel remained completely expressionless during playback. That disturbed me more than the recording itself. Most people hearing incriminating audio experience panic, denial, anger. Daniel simply listened, like a man calculating damage. Then prosecutors introduced phone metadata connecting Daniel to one of the unidentified men from the warehouse footage. The individual, Marcus Hale, possessed prior arrests involving intimidation and illegal surveillance operations. Suddenly, the entire courtroom dynamic shifted. This was no longer merely emotional abuse allegations. The prosecution was now establishing possible criminal conspiracy behavior surrounding the divorce. Several jurors looked visibly shaken. One man in the back row stared at Daniel with open disbelief. But the emotional explosion came unexpectedly during testimony from forensic technology analyst Sarah Whitmore. She explained that investigators recovered deleted files from Daniel's encrypted devices after emergency warrants were issued late the previous evening. Initially, the recovered data appeared financial: schedules, transfers, contractor payments. But buried within the deleted archives was something horrifying: a folder labeled contingency. Even now, I remember the silence inside that courtroom before prosecutors displayed the first recovered document on screen. It contained detailed surveillance logs tracking Emily's daily routines: school pickups, grocery visits, gym schedules, coffee shop locations, vehicle routes, every movement documented for months. Emily broke down immediately when she saw the files. Jurors looked stunned. Spectators whispered in disbelief. But then the prosecutor opened the second file, and the entire courtroom froze, because this one contained photographs of Sophie's school, playground entrances, security gates, teacher schedules, timing notes. I heard someone in the gallery quietly say, "Oh my God." Daniel's attorney objected furiously, but the emotional impact had already detonated across the room. At that moment, even veteran court officers looked disturbed. The prosecutor then asked the forensic analyst whether any deleted messages accompanied the surveillance documents. Sarah Whitmore hesitated briefly before answering yes. The next message displayed on the courtroom screen changed everything forever. It was sent from Daniel's phone to Marcus Hale only 2 weeks before trial. The message read, "If Emily refuses settlement after custody hearing, contingency moves forward immediately." Complete silence swallowed the courtroom. I mean absolute silence. No whispers, no movement, nothing. Even I felt cold reading those words, because suddenly every fear Emily carried, every nightmare Sophie described, every warning sign throughout the case, all of it connected together into one terrifying possibility. Daniel Carter had not merely wanted custody. He wanted control, permanent control, and the deeper the case went, the more it appeared he was prepared to destroy lives to maintain it. Emily could barely breathe through her tears while Sophie's counselor quietly comforted her near the courtroom exit. Meanwhile, Daniel finally lost composure for the first time since proceedings began. Barely, but enough. His face hardened instantly, and his eyes locked onto the prosecution with genuine fury. Not panic, fury, like a man enraged that his secrets were being exposed publicly. And believe me, that reaction terrified me far more than shouting ever would have. Because cold men become most dangerous when humiliation enters the equation. Then came the moment nobody expected. Prosecutors announced investigators had located Natalie Pierce alive less than 12 hours earlier in another state under a changed identity. The courtroom erupted. Reporters outside the courthouse nearly pushed through security hearing the commotion. Daniel's expression changed immediately. For the first time, real emotion appeared on his face. Fear, tiny, controlled, but unmistakable. And at that exact moment, I realized something that sent chills through me. Daniel Carter had fully expected Natalie Pierce to remain missing forever. Court recessed briefly under complete chaos while attorneys argued emergency witness procedures. But before leaving the bench, I looked directly toward Daniel. He stared back at me with a look I will never forget. Not desperation, not confusion, hatred. Pure controlled hatred. And deep down, I knew we were approaching the most explosive phase of the trial. Because if Natalie Pierce testified successfully, Daniel Carter's entire carefully constructed identity was about to collapse in front of the nation. I have replayed thousands of witness testimonies in my career, but there are only a handful I still remember word for word. Natalie Pierce's testimony became one of them. Even before she entered the courtroom, the atmosphere inside the building felt unstable. Reporters crowded the courthouse steps. Security officers blocked hallways. Legal staff whispered nervously behind closed doors. Everyone sensed the Carter case had transformed from a custody dispute into something far more dangerous. And deep down, I knew the next few hours would determine whether Daniel Carter finally lost control or became even more unpredictable. When Natalie Pierce walked into the courtroom, every person in that room turned toward her instantly. She looked nothing like the polished corporate socialite photographs investigators had shown me earlier that morning. The woman entering my courtroom looked exhausted by years of fear. She kept scanning exits automatically, like someone trained by trauma to always locate escape routes first. That detail struck me immediately. Survivors of long-term psychological intimidation develop habits ordinary people never notice. Natalie avoided eye contact with Daniel completely while taking the witness stand, but Daniel stared directly at her without blinking, calm, focused, predatory. I noticed the court reporter subtly shifting uncomfortably beside her keyboard the moment their eyes briefly crossed. Believe me, tension like that cannot be faked. The prosecutor approached carefully, understanding the emotional weight of what was about to happen. Natalie explained that she met Daniel nearly a decade earlier through a financial consulting event in Chicago. At first, according to her testimony, Daniel appeared charming, intelligent, generous, almost impossibly perfect. I have heard that pattern repeatedly in coercive abuse cases. Dangerous individuals rarely reveal themselves early. They study people first. They adapt. They become whatever their target wants most. Natalie described Daniel slowly isolating her from friends, monitoring her movements, controlling communication, and reacting with disturbing calmness whenever she challenged him. That was the worst part, she whispered at one point. He never screamed. The courtroom remained completely silent listening to her. When Daniel got angry, he became quieter. Even now, those words still stay with me, because I had already witnessed that exact behavior throughout the trial. Natalie then described discovering hidden surveillance devices inside her apartment shortly before attempting to leave the relationship. Daniel's attorney objected repeatedly during testimony, but her emotional detail felt painfully genuine. She explained how Daniel once smiled calmly while explaining how easily accidents happen to people who embarrass powerful men publicly. Emily began crying quietly hearing those words because you could see realization spreading across her face. Daniel had used the same tactics for years, the same psychological methods, the same threats hidden beneath politeness. Then Natalie revealed why she disappeared, and what she said next caused complete silence across the entire courtroom. She testified that 3 weeks after filing her police complaint against Daniel, she returned home one night and found her apartment door unlocked. Nothing inside appeared stolen, nothing damaged. But sitting perfectly centered on her kitchen table was a photograph of her younger sister leaving school earlier that afternoon. Natalie's voice broke as she described it. There was no message, she whispered. There didn't need to be. I looked toward the jury at that moment and immediately recognized something important. Fear had shifted entirely onto Daniel Carter. Not suspicion. Fear. Because people were beginning to understand the psychology of the man sitting at the defense table. Daniel remained expressionless through all of it. Not once did he appear emotionally shaken, hearing a woman describe years of terror connected to him. Instead, he occasionally wrote small notes beside his attorney while staring coldly ahead. That composure disturbed the jury visibly. Human beings expect emotional response during accusations involving trauma. Daniel behaved like someone reviewing a business report. Then prosecutors introduced the final piece of evidence recovered from Daniel's encrypted archives. I remember the exact heaviness that entered the courtroom before the file appeared on screen. The document was labeled Family Resolution Strategy. Even the title sounded chilling. Daniel's attorney immediately objected, but after review, I permitted limited presentation because portions directly related to child safety concerns and intimidation patterns. The prosecutor opened the file slowly. What appeared on the courtroom monitor turned the atmosphere ice cold. It contained structured plans, timelines, financial allocations, surveillance coordination, legal pressure strategies, psychological manipulation notes regarding Emily. But then came the sentence that changed everything forever. Highlighted in yellow near the center of the document were the words, "Primary objective, maintain image control at all costs." Underneath, another line read, "If emotional leverage fails, contingency escalates." I heard audible gasps across the courtroom. One juror physically leaned back in his chair looking stunned. Emily covered her mouth instantly. But what horrified me most was the next page, because this one included a section labeled Sophie Adaptation. I still remember the sick feeling in my stomach reading those words. The document detailed behavioral conditioning strategies for controlling Sophie emotionally during custody proceedings. Reward structures, fear reinforcement, isolation tactics, suggested phrases to increase dependency. It read less like parenting notes and more like psychological programming, and suddenly every nightmare Sophie experienced made horrifying sense. She had not simply feared her father, she had been conditioned to fear him. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Spectators shouted angrily. Emily broke down completely. Even experienced officers looked shaken by the material displayed publicly. Daniel's attorney demanded mistrial consideration while prosecutors argued ongoing danger concerns. Through all of it, Daniel sat motionless. But then something happened I never expected. Sophie entered the courtroom unexpectedly with her counselor after hearing the commotion outside. The moment she saw the documents displayed on screen, she froze. Completely froze, and then she looked directly at Daniel. What happened next still haunts me. Daniel smiled at her, not warmly, not comfortingly, calmly, like he was silently reminding her of something. Sophie immediately began trembling uncontrollably. Then she screamed words that shattered whatever illusion remained around him. "I told Mommy he watches us!" The entire courtroom exploded. Jurors looked horrified. Reporters rushed toward exits to relay updates outside. Emily collapsed emotionally, while officers moved quickly toward Sophie. And for the first time since the trial began, Daniel Carter lost control publicly. He stood up suddenly, slamming both hands onto the defense table hard enough to echo through the courtroom. His expression transformed completely. Gone was the calm businessman image. What remained looked cold, furious, exposed. "You are destroying my family," he shouted toward Emily. But nobody in that courtroom believed him anymore, because beneath the anger, something terrifying had finally become visible to everyone watching. Ownership. Daniel did not view his family as people. He viewed them as possessions. And the moment that control disappeared, the mask collapsed. Officers immediately restrained him as shouting erupted across the courtroom. Sophie buried her face into the counselor's shoulder, screaming in panic while Emily cried uncontrollably nearby. I remember gripping the bench harder than usual because even after all my years as a judge, I had rarely witnessed psychological manipulation unravel so violently in public. But deep down, I knew the most dangerous moment had just arrived. Because exposed manipulators often become unpredictable. And as officers escorted Daniel from the courtroom temporarily, he suddenly turned toward me and said something so chilling that the entire room went silent again. He looked directly into my eyes and calmly whispered, "You still don't know everything." And in that moment, I realized the trial was not over, not even close. For a moment after Daniel spoke those words, "You still don't know everything," The entire courtroom felt frozen in place. I have seen violent outbursts before. I have watched hardened criminals threaten witnesses, curse juries, even attack attorneys. But what unsettled me about Daniel Carter was not aggression. It was certainty. He spoke like a man who still believed he possessed power, even after his entire carefully constructed image collapsed in public. And honestly, that realization terrified me more than his anger ever could. Officers escorted him temporarily into a holding area while the courtroom descended into chaos. Reporters outside the building were already broadcasting emergency updates. Social media had exploded within hours. By then, millions of people across the country were following the trial. But the public still did not understand the darkest truth hidden beneath the surface of the case. Not yet. Emily sat trembling beside her attorney while Sophie remained wrapped tightly in a courthouse blanket provided by victim services. I remember looking toward that little girl and feeling something rare for a judge: guilt. Because deep down, I kept asking myself the same question over and over. How long had Sophie been living in fear before anyone finally listened? That thought stayed with me as court recessed briefly. During the recess, federal investigators requested immediate private consultation inside chambers. The moment they entered, I knew something enormous had happened. One agent placed several sealed folders onto my desk, while another quietly informed me that overnight warrants executed on Daniel's financial network uncovered multiple encrypted communications connected to private surveillance contractors across 3 states. But then the lead investigator said something that made my stomach drop instantly. Your Honor, we believe Daniel Carter was preparing to flee the country if custody proceedings failed. The room went silent. They explained that investigators discovered recently purchased international flight arrangements under false identities alongside offshore account activity totaling nearly $8 million. Worse still, one encrypted message appeared to discuss relocating Sophie without Emily's knowledge. My blood ran cold hearing that, because suddenly the contingency language inside Daniel's files became horrifyingly clear. He had never intended to lose control peacefully. He had prepared for escalation long before trial began. Court resumed under extraordinary security measures that afternoon. Additional officers lined the walls while reporters filled overflow rooms throughout the courthouse. The emotional atmosphere inside the courtroom had become almost unbearable. Emily looked emotionally shattered. Sophie remained absent after counselors recommended she not witness further proceedings. And Daniel returned calmer than before. That disturbed me immediately. Because experienced manipulators often become strangely composed after emotional explosions once they accept exposure is unavoidable. It means calculation has replaced performance. He sat quietly beside his attorney, staring straight ahead while prosecutors prepared emergency motions related to child endangerment and obstruction concerns. Then the prosecution introduced the final witness nobody expected: former security contractor Ethan Cole. The moment he entered the courtroom, Daniel's entire posture changed. Tiny details: stiff shoulders, slower breathing, eyes narrowing instantly. That reaction alone told me Ethan terrified him. Cole testified under federal immunity protections after cooperating overnight with investigators. According to his testimony, Daniel hired private operatives over nearly 2 years to monitor Emily continuously during the marriage breakdown. GPS trackers, hidden cameras, phone duplication software. But then Ethan revealed something even darker. Daniel allegedly requested detailed response scenarios if Emily attempted full custody separation. The prosecutor asked him directly what those scenarios involved. Ethan hesitated visibly before answering. Psychological pressure, isolation, reputation destruction, he swallowed hard, and extraction planning. The courtroom erupted instantly. Daniel's attorney objected furiously, but I allowed limited continuation because the testimony directly related to ongoing safety evaluations. Ethan then described meetings where Daniel discussed removing Sophie temporarily until Emily became cooperative during settlement negotiations. Even now, years later, I still remember the horror spreading across the jurors' faces listening to those words. Emily began sobbing uncontrollably while several spectators openly cried nearby. But the moment that changed everything came unexpectedly. Prosecutors presented one final recovered video file discovered only hours earlier on a hidden encrypted drive. I remember the exact silence before playback began. The footage showed Daniel alone inside his home office speaking during what appeared to be a private recorded memo. At first, he sounded calm, analytical, detached. like a businessman reviewing strategy. Then he said something that still keeps me awake some nights. Fear creates loyalty faster than love ever could. Absolute silence filled the courtroom. Even the air felt heavy. Daniel continued speaking in the recording about maintaining authority over family dynamics through psychological dependency. He described emotional control with chilling precision, not emotionally, scientifically, like a man discussing behavioral experiments instead of human beings. And then came the sentence that shattered the room completely. Daniel looked directly into the camera and quietly said, "Children adapt to fear surprisingly well when taught early." Emily collapsed emotionally at that point. Jurors looked horrified. One woman in the gallery covered her mouth and walked out crying. Court officers stood completely motionless, listening to the recording. Meanwhile, Daniel watched the screen expressionlessly, almost detached from his own words. That was the moment I realized something deeply disturbing. Daniel Carter did not think he was evil. He genuinely believed control was intelligence. He viewed empathy as weakness, human attachment as ownership, fear as strategy. And suddenly everything made sense. Sophie's terror, Emily's exhaustion, Natalie's disappearance, the surveillance, the threats, the manipulation. It all traced back to one terrifying reality. Daniel Carter was not losing emotional control during the divorce. He was losing possession of people he believed belonged to him. Then prosecutors revealed the final discovery. Hidden within Daniel's encrypted archives, investigators uncovered hundreds of secretly recorded conversations involving Emily and Sophie spanning several years. The recordings included private bedrooms, bathrooms, school calls, therapy discussions. The entire courtroom reacted with disgust. Even Daniel's attorney looked shaken by then. But what happened next became the viral moment the entire nation would remember forever, because prosecutors played one final audio clip recovered from Sophie's bedroom. The recording captured 8-year-old Sophie crying quietly late one night, asking Daniel why he scared mommy so much. Daniel's voice responded calmly through the speakers, "Because scared people obey better." I have never witnessed emotional devastation hit a courtroom the way it did in that moment. Emily broke completely. Jurors cried openly. Reporters outside began shouting updates into cameras. Even veteran deputies looked disturbed, hearing the coldness in his voice speaking to his own child. But Daniel himself finally revealed who he truly was. He slowly stood up without permission and looked around the courtroom at everyone staring back in horror. Then he smiled again. That same terrifying, controlled smile from the beginning of trial. But this time, there was no mask left covering it. "You're all pretending you're different from me," he said calmly. Officers moved closer immediately. People obey fear every day. Governments, courts, families. I was simply honest about it. The courtroom exploded into chaos again as officers restrained him fully. Emily screamed for Sophie. Reporters rushed exits. Jurors looked stunned beyond words. And as deputies dragged Daniel toward the holding doors, he turned toward the gallery one final time and shouted words that would dominate headlines across the country for weeks afterward. "Love is temporary. Fear lasts forever." The doors slammed behind him, and for the first time since the trial began, complete silence filled the courtroom, because everyone inside that room understood the horrifying truth at the exact same moment. Daniel Carter had never loved his family at all. He only wanted control. The sentencing phase took place 3 weeks later, but to me it felt like an entirely different lifetime. By then, the Carter trial had become one of the most talked about courtroom cases in the country. News stations replayed clips from the proceedings nonstop. Psychologists debated Daniel's behavior publicly. Former victims of coercive abuse began sharing their own stories online after seeing Sophie's testimony. But despite the media chaos surrounding the case, one thing mattered more to me than public reaction. Sophie was finally safe, at least physically. Emotionally, the damage left behind would take years to heal. The courtroom was filled beyond capacity on sentencing day. Reporters occupied every available seat. Security presence remained extremely high because Daniel had received hundreds of threatening messages after the recordings became public. But when deputies finally escorted him into the courtroom, something about him felt different, not broken, not remorseful, empty. The confidence that once radiated from him had disappeared completely. Yet the most disturbing part was this: he still showed no guilt whatsoever. I watched him sit beside his attorney with the same cold posture he carried throughout the trial, calm, controlled, detached, as though the emotional destruction surrounding him still failed to matter. Emily entered moments later holding Sophie's hand carefully. The difference in that little girl compared to the beginning of the trial nearly broke my heart. She still looked fragile, but for the first time, she looked free. She no longer scanned every corner of the courtroom searching for danger. She no longer trembled uncontrollably whenever Daniel moved. Instead, she stayed close to her mother, quietly clutching a stuffed rabbit courthouse counselors had given her during the investigation. That image stayed with me long after the case ended. Because children surviving fear often heal through tiny symbols of safety adults barely notice. Before sentencing arguments began, Emily requested permission to address the court personally. I granted it immediately. She stood slowly behind the podium, struggling to steady her breathing while the courtroom became silent around her. For years, she whispered, I thought surviving meant staying quiet. Tears filled her eyes instantly. Daniel taught us that fear was normal. That control was protection. That silence kept us safe. I remember looking toward the jury members seated in attendance that day and noticing several already emotional before she even continued. But my daughter saved us, Emily said softly, because even while she was terrified, she still told the truth. The courtroom grew so quiet you could hear people breathing. Emily then turned slightly towards Sophie, sitting beside victim services counselors. I spent years believing I was weak, she said, but the bravest person I ever met was an 8-year-old little girl who finally whispered the truth when everyone else was too afraid to see it. I have heard thousands of victim statements in my career. Very few affected me personally. Emily's did, because beneath the pain, there was clarity. She understood something many survivors eventually realized too late. Control disguised as love is one of the most dangerous lies human beings can experience. Daniel showed no emotional response during her statement. None. He stared straight ahead like a man waiting for bad weather to pass. But then Sophie unexpectedly raised her hand softly beside the counselor. The courtroom froze instantly. Her counselor leaned down gently before approaching the bench and informing me Sophie wanted to speak. Every instinct inside me hesitated. She had already endured unimaginable psychological trauma publicly. But when I looked toward her, I saw determination replacing fear for the first time. I allowed it carefully. Sophie walked slowly toward the microphone, holding her stuffed rabbit tightly against her chest. She looked impossibly small standing in front of that packed courtroom. Yet somehow, in that moment, she was the strongest person in the building. Her voice trembled initially. I thought everything was my fault, she whispered. Emily immediately began crying quietly nearby. Sophie glanced toward Daniel only once before looking away again. Daddy said good daughters stay quiet. Several people in the gallery wiped tears from their faces listening to her. Then she said something that I still think about constantly, even years later. But being scared all the time isn't love. Absolute silence filled the courtroom. Not dramatic silence, human silence, the kind created when truth finally reaches people emotionally all at once. Daniel finally reacted slightly then. Tiny movement. His jaw tightened for just a second, hearing his daughter reject the psychological world he spent years building around her. And honestly, I believe that moment hurt him more than the verdict itself, because for the first time, Sophie no longer feared him enough to obey him. The prosecution requested maximum sentencing enhancements involving coercive abuse, unlawful surveillance, intimidation conspiracy, and child psychological endangerment. Federal investigators had since uncovered additional evidence confirming Daniel's extensive illegal monitoring network and obstruction planning. Meanwhile, Daniel's attorney argued diminished emotional judgment caused by obsessive personality pathology. But even during final arguments, Daniel refused accountability entirely. When permitted final allocution before sentencing, he stood calmly and looked directly toward me. Your Honor, he said evenly, history will eventually understand that authority always requires control. Not apology, not regret, philosophy. That alone told me everything I needed to know about him. Some people commit terrible acts impulsively. Daniel committed them intellectually. He genuinely believed fear created order, and that belief nearly destroyed everyone around him. I remember removing my glasses slowly before delivering sentencing because the emotional weight inside that courtroom felt overwhelming. I have presided over this court for 23 years, I began quietly. During that time, I have encountered violence, cruelty, greed, and manipulation in many forms. Daniel stared forward expressionlessly. But this case revealed something especially disturbing, I continued. The deliberate weaponization of fear against the very people who trusted you most. The courtroom remained motionless, listening. I explained that psychological abuse often leaves no visible scars while destroying lives internally for years. I spoke about Sophie specifically because I wanted the public following the case to understand something important. Children normalize fear when adults teach them to, and society frequently misses it until damage becomes severe. Then I finally addressed Daniel directly. "You confused obedience with love," I said. "You confused control with strength. And worst of all, you taught a child that fear was the price of safety." Daniel's expression hardened slightly for the first time. "But today," I continued, "that child is no longer afraid of you." I sentenced Daniel Carter to the maximum allowable penalties under combined state and federal recommendations, including extended incarceration, permanent protective restrictions, financial seizure orders, and lifetime no-contact provisions regarding Emily and Sophie. The moment the sentence ended, the courtroom exhaled collectively like people finally escaping a storm. Emily collapsed emotionally into tears while Sophie hugged her tightly. Reporters rushed outside to announce the verdict nationwide. Officers moved Daniel toward the exit in restraints. But just before disappearing through the courtroom doors, he turned back one final time. Everyone held their breath waiting, yet he said nothing. Because for the first time since the trial began, nobody feared him anymore. And that was the one thing Daniel Carter never learned how to survive. Months later, I received a handwritten letter from Sophie through Victim Services. Inside was a simple drawing of a courtroom with sunlight shining through windows. Underneath, she had written one sentence in careful, uneven handwriting: "The scary house is gone now." I kept that drawing in my chambers for years afterward, because despite everything horrifying I witnessed during that trial, it reminded me why courts matter when they function correctly. Justice is not only about punishment. Sometimes, justice is teaching frightened people that fear does not own them forever. I still think about that case late at night sometimes, about how easily evil can hide behind politeness, about how many families live silently under control disguised as love, and about one little girl who changed everything simply because she finally whispered the truth. In all my years on the bench, that was the lesson I never forgot. Fear may control people temporarily, but truth eventually destroys it.